We're now going to move on to the schizoid personality. These schizoid personalities are interesting in the sense that they're quite colorless as far as personalities go. They seem very bland, would be maybe the best way to put them or describe them. And in terms of some of the characteristics that we would see, these are individuals that are quite solitary, so very, very introverted. According to one perspective, they seem to be indifferent to praise and criticism. These are individuals that are by themselves. They're not really involved or wanting relationships of any sort. They have no desire to be sexual. The things that they do typically will involve solitary activities, so few friends. And the other thing that we see with schizoid personalities, I should say, is they come across as kind of cold and detached. It's kind of interesting on the internet. I wound up filling out this questionnaire on personality disorders just to see how I'd come out. That's how I came out. I came out as schizoid, and it was saying one of the correlates of it is that their spouses, if these individuals in fact are married, their spouses will complain that these individuals are not very emotionally connected, which is exactly what my spouse says all the time. So it was kind of interesting, kind of a bit of an eye-opener. Of course, I didn't share with her the site. I wouldn't want any confirmation or ammo for the fire or the gun, so to speak. Okay, so in terms of the history of this, Hawke in 1910 talked about a shut-in personality, which seems to have some sort of parallel to schizoid. Kraepelin talked about this. Interestingly enough, he saw a parallel between autistic personalities and schizoid. He was thinking that the autistic personality is more of an attenuated type of form. Bleuler coined the term schizoid in 1924, and he came up with this concept that, and this is not how we think of schizophrenia in the modern era. He talked about these four characteristics. Sometimes they're referred to as the 4 A's of schizophrenia: autistic thinking, loose associations, disturbed affect, and ambivalence. And he was saying that an individual, if they had schizophrenia, they would exhibit a number of these features. But if a person had exhibited one of them, then he considered them to be schizoid. So you can see how there's a conceptual relationship between schizoid and schizophrenia, even though that link is really a tenuous one or a weak one. You may be wondering, what do you mean by autistic thinking? Yeah, it's funny, I was thinking about that one myself, and I don't know specifically what Bleuler meant by that, whether he meant individuals that had trouble with stimulation, like they become overstimulated. I was thinking that might be one way of looking at it, or maybe having very narrow interests or rigid ways of doing things. That's what I was kind of thinking what he meant by that, but don't quote me on this. So what do you think these individuals would be like to interview if you were a psychologist? Like, how would you approach that? I think you're bang on there. It'd be like pulling teeth. In terms of the history, Kretschmer talked about two different types of schizoids. He talked about some schizoid individuals are very sensitive, in contrast to what the modern diagnostic version of schizoid is. This hyperesthetic personality, as it was referred to, which we would call avoidant personality. And you'll recall that avoidants are individuals that are high on introversion, but they're also quite neurotic. Those are sort of the main colors of it. Whereas the insensitive type, this would be the schizoid personalities. And it's been argued that, are they really as insensitive as we're describing diagnostically? It could be on the surface of things, they really don't express a whole lot of emotion, but maybe they do feel a lot. And one of the things that Kretschmer had noticed is that schizoid personalities, they tended to have a fragile body type and poor musculature. So in other words, they tended to be quite thin. When we think about schizoid personality in the past, it was really an amalgamation of what we now call schizoid, but also avoidant and schizotypal personality disorders. And in the DSM-3, what they wound up doing is taking the concept of schizoid and then dividing it into 3 pieces. So if you're ever reading any literature prior to 1980 and they use the term schizoid, that could mean any one of these 3 things. Any of the writings perhaps after 1980, then we could be more confident that when you hear the term schizoid, it's actually referring to schizoid personality disorder. From the modern perspective of the DSM, the 2 essential features of schizoid personality is detachment from social relationships, in other words, profound introversion, as well as the restricted range of emotions. So those are the 2 key things. And some have gone as far as to say, people like Robinson as an example, is that the schizoid person or the schizotypal individuals exhibit the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, or at least in an attenuated form, whereas schizoid personalities exhibit the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. Associated features. These are individuals that they do not desire emotional intimacy. And as I was thinking about this, looking at the diagnostic criteria, as well as individuals that I know that might have these types of tendencies, I would imagine that rather than being involved in a relationship, they would probably spend a lot of time looking at internet porn, if I had to guess. This is probably what's happening here. These are individuals, if they're men, they're not likely to marry. If the woman has schizoid personality, they would have been pursued to be married. Schizoid personalities often engage in activities that are intellectually abstract, things like playing chess or these fantasy games that you might find online. And as you saw with the interview with Jerry, he's a very bland person. There doesn't seem to be too much colorful about him. Although I don't know if you could say that he was necessarily lacking social graces or really lacking social syntax. He seemed to know how to respond to the interviewer questions, although some don't. Some of these individuals can still function in society. By this I mean holding a job. What kinds of jobs do you think schizoid personalities would take? A projectionist. Yes, that would be a good activity where you don't have a lot of involvement with individuals. I would also say individuals where they can work shift work, they will volunteer for the 12 to 8 where there is nobody around. I remember years ago I had a job like that. It was at a compressor station that never ran, and it was in the middle of the bush, and there was nobody there other than myself. So there wasn't really all that much to do. And despite the fact I don't like having, or I don't need a lot of person contact, I was getting bored that there was nobody there on that job, so it starts to get to you after a while. Although some individuals, that's the thing they gravitate to. And quite frankly, from a health point of view, it's probably the worst thing they can do. If you were going to help somebody, if you saw them in practice and they were struggling with person contact, change their shift to the 4 to 12. At least they're having some person contact, maybe not a full-blown day shift, but they need some contact. Anger, don't seem to get too emotional about things. Their life just seems adrift. They may be taking university courses, but they just never get around to finishing off their degree. An individual that I worked with a few years ago, his son was a lot like this. And it was a real frustration to the father because his father was a professional